Hey guys, welcome back to another podcast episode of Inclusite Talk. It's Chidinma here again, and this time it'll just be me on the episode. Today I'll be discussing protests and riots, specifically the differences between the two, their historical impact, and how they've shaped social change over time. We'll also explore how protests can evolve into riots, the societal impact of both, and what we can learn from these moments in history. Without further ado, let's talk. Okay, so let's begin. So, at its core, a protest is a statement commonly made through actions that expresses disapproval, objects, or even supports a particular issue, policy, or injustice. The common thread, though, that we see in protests is the intention to convey a message without resorting to violence. So essentially, protests are peaceful assemblies. Protests come in many different forms, most notably marches, sit-ins, demonstrations, and there's so many examples. The civil rights movement in the US was fueled by protests, some examples being the March on Washington and the Greensboro sit-ins. So a protest usually always begins as a peaceful assembly. I am emphasizing the word begins because as we've seen throughout history, many protests turn into something entirely different when external provocations, such as police aggression, occur. This is when riots are introduced. A riot is a violent and chaotic event. It often involves property damage, looting, clashes with law enforcement and police. Like I've mentioned before, when external provocations occur, peaceful protests can quickly turn into riots. Many of the 2020 BLM protests turned into riots because of police aggression. Police had used tear gas and shot rubber bullets at protesters. So the police were, exhibiting violence onto the protesters, and they felt like they weren't being heard, and so they acted out in violence as well. Onto a different topic, a really big topic that's really important that we address, is how, the huge role the media plays in shaping how we perceive these events. Take the BLM protests, for instance. These protests were originally peaceful demonstrations calling for an end to police brutality. But when violence erupted, especially during the 2020 protests, they were quickly labeled as riots by certain media outlets. The term riot, of course, has a very negative connotation behind it. But what we need to understand is that it makes the whole event seem chaotic, destructive, and unorganized, rather than focusing on the reason behind the protest. On the other side, when it comes to other movements, the media may choose to refer to them as civil unrest or just demonstrations to paint a different narrative. And this essentially just, depends on the person you are and what you believe in. This leads to a bigger issue that we need to talk about, is the way the public sees a protest or riot often depends on their biases. And it sucks, but that's just the truth. This is why, for example, some people sympathize with the January 6th rioters, the people that attacked the Capitol, and some don't. 1 in 5 Republicans even went as far as to blame BLM for the violence that they instigated on that day. That's just an example of how biased people truly are. On the next topic, I think it's really important that we understand that protests, um, and riots and these assemblies of people don't just spring up out of nowhere. It is a product of lack of political freedom and oppression by the government. It's a product of, the suppressing of free speech. It's a product of marginalized communities feeling unrepresented and, not having their voices heard and being excluded. Um, these protests and these riots don't just pop up. They don't just happen just because, this is a product of accumulation over time of just being ignored. For example, and speaking, from a Black woman perspective, um, just looking at the way history has what has happened to my people throughout history, it's a no-brainer that it's going to get to a point where people are going to get mad. Our voices are being ignored. We are yelling for an end to police brutality. Our people are dying and no one is doing anything about it. In 2020, there were so many police brutality casings. It was insane. And I think I was I think I was in seventh grade at the time, and just seeing all of that happen and just, all the protests happening, that sparked something in me. And I was like, it makes sense why these people are angry. When a group of people feel their needs and their voices are being ignored, that's why they might turn to protest or even rise as a way of forcing their grievances into the public eye. And, this has been a major cause of civil unrest. Like, this has been happening dating back to the French Revolution. The French peasants were suffering, their voices weren't being heard, and finally they pushed back. There was a breaking point, and they eventually dismantled the French monarchy and transformed the entire political system in France. And that's kind of like a parallel to what happened in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests, especially after the death of George Floyd, and how just it felt like nothing was being done, and there was no justice being brought to the Black community. That's an example of how years of feeling unrepresented, can fuel mass uprisings. We have been yelling and screaming for equality and freedom and justice since the beginning of time, since slavery. So it's just like, it's not getting better. We're mad now. That's essentially what it feels like. Um, so don't think that people just riot just for fun. People just want to break into stores, and I'm not saying that burning down cars and breaking into stores and looting is a good thing. I'm just saying that there's a reason why. And it's important that there's a reason why. However, I think it's also really important to talk about the good that can come out of protests. Even though protests and riots are, in a way, interlocked, I do believe that they are definitely two very different things. Riots are a product of aggression and an outside provocation, as I said before. And protests are a product of, when a group of people strongly believe in something and they want to talk about it and they want to get the government to hear what they're talking about. And there's so much good that can come out of that when the government actually listens. The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, these people worked tirelessly. They protested everything, the boycotts, all of that stuff. Martin Washington, all of those protests eventually led up to the Civil Rights Act, and it prohibited discrimination of race, gender, ethnicity, all of that. The women's suffrage movement in the 20th century, even going back in time, all of those prominent female figures, they protested and they protested and they protested, and eventually the 19th Amendment got passed. So there's so much good that can come out of protests when the government reacts and responses in the right way. Unfortunately, a common response in today's day and age is the deployment of law enforcement, essentially riot police. And these officers are armed heavily with not just tear gas and rubber bullets, as I said, but guns and batons to control. And you cannot expect to, you cannot go to a protest and control it, because that's when it turns into a riot, because we are mad. We are fighting for something, and you come with your guns and your violence and your aggression in order to control us and contain us because you don't want to cause unrest. That's when it's like, okay, now we're mad. We want you to really hear what we're saying. The Chicago riots, for example, police clashed violently with the protesters, and it led to a riot, and it led to injuries and intensification of the entire situation. So I think it's really important that we need to just examine how we approach these protests, and we shouldn't, immediately deploy officers onto the grounds of these protests and, try and control the crowds with violence, because, we're trying to get our voices heard. There's a saying, by any means necessary. These people are serious. So when you come to us with violence, by any means necessary means we're going to come back at you with violence. So I think that is something that we really do need as a society, not just in America, that we need to, that's a reform that we need to make. We need to approach protests in a more peaceful manner, because there's so much good that can be done when our voices actually are heard and taken into account, and, they actually think about what we're asking for. At the end of the day, I think that we shouldn't stop protesting. I think that the police need to change how they respond to protests in order to stop riots. If we respond to protests in a peaceful manner, then these riots wouldn't be happening in the first place. Unrest is a reflection of a deeper societal issue that needs to be addressed. It's accumulation of being ignored, and that's just simply what it is. So, yeah, that's it for today's episode of Incluside Talk. I really hope that I helped shed some light on this topic, and I really hope that some of you learned that didn't really know much about this topic beforehand. And if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow up for the next one. And thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.